thank you. Right, first of all, can you all hear me if I talk like that? Actually, I might liberate this microphone because I always find it easier to hold it in my hand. Okay, well, now, what I'm going to provide this evening and what you're going to hear is probably stretching it a bit to call it a lecture. It's more going to be a sort of sharing of gossip, which is generally the form that my talks tend to take. I have been for the past 2 years, because although the Monogram Murders only came out last September, obviously I knew that it was going to be happening a long time before then. So I have been for several years in the role really of Agatha's sidekick, and it's a role that Agatha herself wrote a lot about, and it's been interesting to me being in the role of sidekick to the great genius, because that's what all detective novels are about. That's what Agatha Christie's novels are about. You know, Poirot or Miss Marple is the great genius who will always, get it right in the end. But there's often a trusty sidekick who is nowhere near as genius-ish as the great genius, but still fairly important and necessary. And sometimes the great genius needs the sidekick to do something fairly mundane, or to say something fairly irrelevant like, I think I'll have sausages for breakfast, and then the detective goes, you mentioning the word sausages? Even though it had nothing to do with anything, it totally made me think of the whole solution to the mystery. So that was the first thing that struck me about being Agatha's sidekick, is that it's a very appropriate role given the kind of books Agatha Christie wrote. Now, I should say right from the start that it would never have occurred to me in a million years that I might write a Poirot novel, or indeed a novel featuring any characters created by another author. These books are becoming more and more part of the literary landscape, but what's interesting is there's still a kind of confusion about what we call these kind of books. Do we call them literary reincarnations? Do we call them the new, am I the new Agatha Christie? I would say obviously not, because, I'm not Agatha Christie. How do we talk about these books? I've noticed in the things that have been written and published about the Monogram Murders, people have said it's a revival of Poirot, it's, bringing him back from the dead, all these kind of funny ways of describing it, because people have never really had this discussion before. What do we call these books featuring a character invented by one writer and now being written about by another? So I call it a continuation novel. And I always am careful to say that I've written a new Poirot novel rather than a new Christie novel, because I think, these things are important. If I start saying that I'm writing Agatha Christie novels, there's a sense in which that's, a very important sense in which that's not true. But to say I'm writing a Poirot novel is clearly true. It's just a different kind of Poirot novel. The other interesting thing about books like this is that whole swathes of people are prejudiced against them. Really prejudiced against them, like think they're bad and wrong and shouldn't happen. Which is very different from just not wanting personally to read them. If somebody said to me, there's going to be a new 50 Shades of Grey novel written by David Attenborough, I might think, not much about that combination particularly appeals to me, so I probably won't read it, but I wouldn't think this is bad and wrong and shouldn't happen. But I realised when it was announced in the papers that Sebastian Faulks was going to be writing a Jeeves and Wooster novel, and suddenly in 4 broadsheet newspapers there were columns, long columns saying, this is terribly depraved and an absolute disgrace. I thought, wow, people actually think these things are morally wrong. So that was really interesting because, before this book I'd published, 10 crime novels, 5 books of poetry. I've published lots of books, and I'm used to getting good reviews, bad reviews, mixed reviews, but I'd never before been in a situation where everyone's, had a view before the book was even written, let alone published. So when it was announced that I was going to be writing a Poirot novel, the discussion about whether my Poirot novel was good, evil, mediocre, doomed to failure, bound to be brilliant, the argument started at that point. And I thought, this is great, I don't even have to write the thing. You know, people can have the argument about whether it's, you know, amazing or worthless without me even lifting a finger. But weirdly, it made me determined to enjoy the whole process, to write the best book I could. I have a very, very strong contrary streak. And the minute I got wind of the idea that some people thought this was something I actively shouldn't do, I thought, oh, it might therefore be as much fun as all the other things I shouldn't do, but do. Then it'll be great. So that has been my attitude ever since. And it took me several months to come up with my sort of definitive answer to the people who have said, I mean, to be fair, 90% of the reaction I've seen or had access to has been amazingly positive. But to the few people who say, you know, don't you think you really should not have done this, it took me months to come up with the right answer. And the right answer, it seems to me, is if I hadn't done it, if I hadn't written this book, then all the people, and there are lots of them, who really wanted to read it and enjoy it, and who have read it and enjoyed it, wouldn't have been able to. Whereas if I did write and publish the book, then everyone who thinks it's a terrible sin and oughtn't to happen can just ignore it. And that, you know, they'll still be fine. So that seemed to me to settle that matter. But how did it come about in the first place? As I said before, I would never in a million years have thought that I might ever do this. And if I'd been asked, will there ever be another Poirot novel, another Miss Marple novel, I'd never even thought about it, but I would probably have said, well, no, I doubt very much that there will, because the fact that it hadn't already happened by, 2013 suggested to me that clearly nobody wanted it to happen. The estate of Agatha Christie didn't want it to happen. And without ever really thinking about it, that was what I had always imagined was the case. And then one day, it was probably middle of 2012, I got a phone call from my literary agent. Now, I should explain at this point, because you've never met my literary agent, but probably some of you have seen the TV drama House with Hugh Laurie as Dr. House. My agent is the literary equivalent of Dr. House. He's an amazing genius, more talented than almost any other agent or even human being, but he's really, really odd. He doesn't do things in the normal way. He's socially awkward, he says the wrong thing, he arrives at important book launches and instead of saying how lovely to see everybody, he says, where are the crisps? Can't find the crisps. That was what he actually did at the launch of the Monogram Murders, which was at the Ritz Hotel. And everyone else was going, isn't this marvellous? Oh, Agatha Christie, isn't it marvellous? He was like, can't find any crisps, I'm going home. So he's an odd chap. And he rang me one day, and he did that thing that 1970s TV detectives sometimes do, They've just interviewed a suspect, nothing really noteworthy has happened in the interview, and they're just sort of heading towards the door, and then they turn back with their hand on the door handle and say, oh, just one more thing, and that turns out to be the crucial thing. My agent did that in this phone conversation. He told me a load of other sort of ordinary administrative things, and we were saying goodbye, and then he said, oh yeah, one more thing. He said, I was at HarperCollins offices today, and I was talking to this editor about the Jane Austen project, which is, I'm sure many of you have heard of it, contemporary novelists are writing, modern versions of Jane Austen's classics. So Joanna Trollope has written a version of Sense and Sensibility, and Val McDermott has written Northanger Abbey. And my agent, I don't know which of the modern writers he represents, but he must represent one of them. So he was at HarperCollins' office talking about continuation novels or, things of that ilk. And he happened to be sitting next to a whole shelf of Agatha Christie novels because HarperCollins is Agatha Christie's publisher. And just off the top of his head, because he often just comes out with strange, unexpected things, he said to this editor, of course, you know what you should do? if you're doing things like Jane Austen and famous writers and dead writers and living writers, you know what you should do? You should get my client, Sophie Hannah, to write a new Agatha Christie novel because she's a huge fan. And so my agent was, telling me this story. He said, so, I just told them. I just said. Well, why aren't you doing that? And he has a way, when he suggests something, he has a way of doing it so that it sounds as if he's really ticking you off for not having done it already. So he's reporting all this to me on the phone, and I'm thinking, oh no, how embarrassing. It's kind of like hearing, your parents come back from a school parents' evening and say, well, I've suggested that they make you head girl. So I said, right, okay, well, how did that suggestion go down? Because there's no point saying to him, I wish you hadn't done that. There's just, it's like saying that to the wind or a snowstorm or something. So I thought, okay, damage limitation. I said, what happened? How did they react? He said, well, the editor said that there's no way that would ever happen because the family are very protective of Agatha's legacy and they definitely don't want any kind of continuation novels. I said, oh, right, okay, well, thank you for that. And I was actually sort of quite cross with him because I thought, right, he's basically out of nothing and nowhere created an opportunity for me to feel rejected from something that it would never have occurred to me to want to do. But it's that weird sort of psychological thing, someone rings you up and says, you may not spend a fortnight staying at the Taj Mahal. Absolutely not. And you're suddenly like, oh, I feel all rejected. I might want to do that. What if I in fact do want to do it? So I said to him, oh well, never mind, because clearly that was never going to happen. I slightly wish you hadn't suggested it, but never mind. Too late for that. But obviously I said, that would never happen. The family are known for not wanting things like that to happen. And also, even if they did want it to happen, they presumably wouldn't want me to do it. They would presumably want somebody really eminent, like P.D. James or Ruth Rendell, or somebody sort of massively internationally best-selling like Patricia Cornwell. They definitely wouldn't want me. But thanks for thinking that it might be a possibility. And he said, yeah, well, they just said no. They just said flat out no. I was like, okay, right. I think we've covered that. So I put the phone down and walked across my living room. And before I got from the phone to the sofa, I stopped and thought, oh no, this is now even more annoying because I've realised that idea that I've had for a plot for all these years that I've never quite managed to use in one of my regular books, which are contemporary psychological thrillers, that plot that I haven't managed to lever into my psychological thrillers yet would be perfect for a Poirot novel. And I realised why I hadn't been able to make the idea work in a contemporary psychological thriller. The reason was, and literally it had not occurred to me until this experience happened. In a golden age detective novel, firstly, it's accepted by the audience that the priority is telling a great, surprising story. If you think of Murder on the Orient Express, and Then There Were None, which are incidentally Agatha's two best-selling books, she is the best-selling novelist of all time. She's outsold only by Shakespeare and the Bible, and not dissing either of them, but they aren't novelists, so among, they're still good, they're good, but novelists, she is far and away the best-selling one of all time. But people, and including me actually until quite recently, people imagine probably that means all her books are just very, very best-selling, but that's not actually true. There are between 5 and 10 which are enormously best-selling, and even among those 5 or 10 there's 3 or 4 that are really, really enormously best-selling.
Cat Among the Pigeons, that was my favourite. Do you know that one?
I do, but that, yeah.
Does that sell well?
It obviously sells well compared to, most books, but it's not among her really huge titles. I know. I know, you kind of wish that they were all equally best-selling, because some of the best ones are not the sort of obviously famous ones. But anyway, if we take And Then There Were None and Murder on the Orient Express, and I'm not going to give away any of the plots to either, because I'm sure you all know the twists in both. Clearly, what's made those books so popular is that the twist, the denouement, the solution to the mystery is just amazing. It's imaginatively ingenious in a way that sort of expands our sense of what's possible. You know, I really didn't think that that could be a possibility, and yet it is. It's scientifically possible, and it turns out that that's how the story ends. Now, readers of contemporary crime fiction, not all, you know, I'm going to make some dismissive generalisations here, not all, but there's more of a tendency now to be obsessed with what people think is realism and what people think is plausibility, but actually they get those things mixed up with how likely is it to happen today in Basingstoke. And that's a different thing. You know, plausible means, could it happen once? Some of the most interesting things only happen once. The example I always use is Canoe Man. Remember that chap who he and his wife pretended he was dead? And they told their grown-up sons that he was dead, and actually he was living in a cupboard in their house, growing a long beard, and when the sons came round to visit, he'd go through a hole in the wall to the house next door, which implausibly he also owned, and it was empty. You know, and then he got his photograph taken for a property website in Panama, and his sons went, "Oh, I do believe that's my father who's meant to be dead." Now, you know, hopefully that will never happen again, but it did happen once. So my plot idea that I'd had for years and tried to get into my psychological thrillers and failed was one that would have delighted a golden age audience, because it was high concept, it was ingenious, it was quite baroque, it was quite show-offy. But I knew that if I put it into one of my, you know, contemporary thrillers, there'd be a bit of sort of, yes, but, you know, well, I've not really heard of this happening to anyone who lives on my street, kind of thing. So that was one reason. And another reason why it worked better in a Golden Age detective novel is that the way people's minds work changes depending on what historical period they live in. And that's quite a scary thought. We all like to think we're sort of independent-minded, but we're not. There are, I mean, just to use a totally unconnected example, things like, you know, duty to one's country, for example. In a novel written in 1929, or a novel written about 1929, it might be quite plausible that some people would go and fight in a war because their country was at war and not sort of moan about it. I'm not saying people shouldn't moan. I would definitely moan if I had to go and fight in a war. But if you were writing a book now, set in contemporary Britain, and everyone was drafted to go and fight for their country in a war, everyone would be, you know, whinging and setting up occupied tents and things like that, because that's more the contemporary mindset. What other things? I mean, there's just loads of things. Anyway, the motivation required for my denouement to work as well as it could, I realised was something that would definitely apply more in the late 1920s. It was a mindset that more people would be able to relate to. So it's not that it couldn't have been done. And I would have, if I hadn't written this book, I would have put it somehow into one of my regular books, because what I loved about this idea when I thought of it was that it was Agatha Christie-ish. And I can remember thinking, oh, that's a really Agatha Christie-ish kind of style of twist. And I even thought to myself, you know, if Agatha Christie had just lived for another 30 years, she would have thought of that. Because actually, and I think she would, just as I also think, and this is equally unprovable, I also think that if Agatha Christie hadn't invented Murder on the Orient Express, I eventually would have done. I can't prove that, but I have a very strong hunch that it's the case. So I had my plot idea, and it was very Agatha-ish, and I thought, right, why is it Agatha-ish? You know, what is it about Agatha Christie's books that make them different from all the rest of crime fiction. Because, you know, any of you who've read Agatha and also read other crime novelists will know that her books are just different, and there's loads of ways in which they're different. But one of the crucial ways, I think, is that she is actually a novelist of ideas. She's a kind of philosopher of the murder mystery. She doesn't just want to tell a story about people in a situation because it's sort of compelling for her. She wants to explore all the different possibilities. She will have sat down and thought to herself, in fact I know she did because I've seen all the archives, all her notebooks. She sat down and thought to herself, okay, I've had murders committed for all these reasons so far. What other possibilities are there? What is so outlandish that no one would guess it, and yet brilliantly obvious at the same time once you know the answer? And so that, for me, is the unique thing about Agatha's work. You read her novels, and after each one you think, yes, that as well could happen. And even, you know, some of her books, Murder in Mesopotamia is a good example. The solution to that mystery is incredibly high concept and just brilliant. That one is a bit implausible. You know, if I told you what it was, which I won't, you would kind of go, yeah, really? That probably couldn't happen. But it's such a great idea, and Agatha always prioritised the great idea, the structural pushing of the boundary. So she was actually quite an experimental writer. Some of the risks she took in her storytelling were much braver than anything, you know, or than most of what people are doing now. And so this idea I felt it was in that category. I felt it was a very surprising way for something to turn out, and a kind of parallax view type situation. It looks as though it must be one way, and then it turns out to be another way, in a way that's kind of obvious but also unguessable. So I was then even more depressed. I thought, right, here I am with a brilliant idea for a Poirot novel, and I can't write it because I've just been rejected from writing it, even though no one's even thought about it. So I just thought, oh well, you know, nothing to be done about it. I'll just write a regular thriller and I'll find a way of using it. And then the next day my agent rang again. And now another of his strange habits is he doesn't tell stories in chronological order while making sure that you have all the necessary information to understand. You know, he'll just say the first bit that he feels like saying without first, you know, backing it up. So he rang me again and he said, so anyway, I've arranged that meeting with the Christie estate. I said, oh, sorry, I don't understand. Are you meeting the Christie estate? He said, no, you are. I said, right, why? He said, well, they want to meet you. They've asked to meet you. I said, right, but I thought we established yesterday that this wasn't happening. He said, well, no, it almost definitely won't. So I said, right, so fill in the blanks. What's actually happened? Has the Christie estate got wind of the plan and asked for the opportunity to reject me in person, or has something else happened? Anyway, turned out that the editor from HarperCollins had had a meeting with the Christie estate the following day, so the day after they'd met my agent, and completely surprisingly, they had said to HarperCollins, you know, we've always thought we didn't want to do this in the past, but we're thinking now the time might be right to have a continuation novel, either Poirot or Marple. And the editor kind of went, really? And Matthew Pritchard, who is Agatha's only grandchild, and he's the chairman of Agatha Christie Limited, so he is really the sort of protector of her legacy, and has been all his working life. He's sort of devoted his life to, you know, looking after his grandmother's business affairs. He's an amazing man. So David, the editor at HarperCollins, said to him, really? Because, you know, I'm surprised. I never thought I'd hear you say those words. And Matthew said, well, yes, not really sure we want to do it, but I think we might want to consider it, even though we'll probably then not do it, but at least we ought to think about it. So David said, well, by complete coincidence, yesterday an agent told me that he had an author who's a huge Agatha fan. who'd be brilliant at writing a Poirot novel. So maybe we should set up a meeting. And Matthew said, oh, I don't think we want to go that far. But then he spoke to his new managing director, who was very keen on the idea of a new Christie brand novel. And she said, yes, let's meet this writer. You can always say no. So this meeting was arranged. I turned up with my agent. We walked into the room, and there was a big sort of mahogany table. And at the other end of the table were some very nervous-looking members of the Christie family, because I don't think they knew what to expect, but I think they felt that, the publishers really wanted another book, as publishers tend to do. And I think they were a bit alarmed that somehow if they let me into the room, that might be, they might never be able to go back after that. And I was quite alarmed as well, because I was worried that somehow I was kind of inflicting myself on this poor innocent family who probably didn't want me there at all. So the first thing I said was, look, can I just say, if you aren't 100% sure that you want this to happen, I'm really happy to just go away, not write a Poirot novel, not write a Marple novel. And I said, look, Agatha Christie is my favourite writer of all time. She has been since I was 12. And it would keep me awake at nights if I had to worry about distressing her family. That would not be a good thing for me to have in my life. So, really feel free to say we're not interested. So then David, the HarperCollins editor, says, tell them your idea, because by now it had travelled back to David that I had a very Agatha-ish idea. So I had to, and I never do this, I never discuss the ideas for a book before I've written the book, because my books, like Agatha's, because she was my biggest influence, my plots are quite outlandish. They're not about drug dealers shooting each other, which is very sort of everyday and plausible. They're about those really weird, unique, one-off situations, like Canoe Man, where everyone goes, yeah, that's all a bit odd really, isn't it? I hope people in general aren't like that, just the ones involved in that particular story. So Peter, my agent, never heard any of my plots. My editor Carolyn never heard any of my plots. I would always write the book, because it's only in writing the book that you can show how it can work. But I couldn't refuse to describe my plot idea to the Christie family, because that was what we were all there for. So I said, right, okay, well obviously this is just the bare bones, but, and then I told them my idea, and then there was silence. I thought, oh no, maybe the idea's rubbish. And then Matthew said, that sounds very much like the sort of idea my grandmother might have had. And I said, yes, well, I thought so as well. So then we sort of had a tentative discussion. He said, if we did want you to write the book, when might you write it? And I said, well, I would start it in September after the summer holidays. And he said, that's when my grandmother always started writing it. And then we just talked a bit about Agatha's work. Matthew said to me, would you want to write a Poirot novel, a Marple novel? Now that was actually something that I was undecided about, because I did equally love Poirot and Miss Marple. I didn't really prefer one or the other. But it seemed to me that the idea I had was more suited to Poirot, because Poirot is a show-off. Miss Marple isn't a show-off. Miss Marple's very clever, but when she delivers the solutions to the mysteries, she really does it in as few words as possible. And then she sort of goes off and has a cup of tea and starts knitting again. She doesn't sort of hang around to bask in any glory or anything like that. Whereas Poirot not only likes to sort of take centre stage in the room full of suspects and make a big production out of it, but he likes to actually prolong that process by going through all the suspects and why they would have done it and how they would have done it if they'd done it. And then he'll say, but of course you didn't do it. And then you would have done it for this reason and in that way, but you didn't do it either. And he'll go through every suspect and have the whole drawn out production. And my plot idea had several stages to it. So I thought that would really suit Poirot. He could have a captive audience as usual, and he could do his whole thing with a big sort of fanfare and then reveal the solution. So Matthew liked that idea, and that all seemed to be fine. And then he said, and would you want to do anything to Poirot? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you know, would you want to update him to the 21st century, like the recent TV adaptation of Sherlock Holmes? Would you want to, I don't know, give him a wife or a love life of any kind? Now, I'd never thought about this because I didn't really think it was going to happen. Even at that point in the meeting, I still didn't think it was going to happen. But I instinctively knew that I didn't want to update Poirot in any way. And so I said, no, absolutely not. I said, with a series character, especially a famous, much-loved series character like Poirot, you have to get the exact right blend of the reassuring familiar and the new and exciting. If it's too familiar, people will think, well, it feels like I've read this one already. If it's too different, then it's not comfort reading for all the people who've loved all the others. So you've got to get that blend right. And it seemed fairly obvious to me that the reassuring familiar bit should be Poirot himself, who should be absolutely classic Agatha Christie's Poirot, not Googling anybody, not having a Twitter account, not getting into fights in the Guardian comment boxes underneath comment is free pieces. Old traditional Poirot. And then the new and exciting element should come in the form of the new case. Because if you notice, with Agatha's Poirot novels, he never changes, really. He's almost more of a sort of legend or superhero or sort of superhuman than he is a real person. He's got lots of quirks. So you can easily visualise him and you know what he does and doesn't like. You know, he likes his mint syrup alcohol-y drinks and he likes his nice clothes and stuff. So he's got all those sort of accessories of personhood. But he's not really a real person. He conveniently appears wherever he's needed and you never know where he's been in the interim. He's just there. He's staying in the house where someone's about to be murdered. He just happens to be a guest there, you know. So he, it seemed to me, didn't need to change at all. And Matthew was, I think, quite reassured to hear that I wasn't going to do anything un-Poirot-ish with Poirot. So then they said, okay, well, you know, let us think about it, and it's going to, you know, probably won't happen. All along, everyone was going, yes, it probably won't happen. Almost definitely not. But let's just talk about it a bit more, even though it's not going to happen. And then probably about 3 or 4 months later, we heard that they did indeed want it to happen. And since then, you know, ever since people decided that, yes, we're going ahead, it's been absolutely brilliant. Everybody warned me about working with the estate of a famous writer. It was a very sort of non-specific form of warning. But many, many people in the book trade said to me, oh, you do not want to get involved with the estate of a famous writer. Did you hear what happened to all those people who worked with the James Bond estate? And I'd say, no, I didn't hear. Tell me, what happened? Oh. Non-specific bad things happened. So no one actually told me what any of these dangers were. But with the Christie estate, it couldn't have been jollier, really. Once they decided we were doing the book, everyone was very excited. For Matthew and the family, the brilliant thing they hoped to get out of it was to get real, serious media attention for Agatha Christie's work. You can't really get, you know, double-page spreads in national broadsheets for books, however brilliant, that were published 70 years ago. You need, you know, because the media is so sort of now, you need a front list title. But once you've got one, once you've even got the rumour of one, you can then have a double-page spread saying, isn't Murder on the Orient Express brilliant? So as soon as this book was announced, before I'd started writing it, sales of Agatha Christie's Poirot novels more than doubled in the UK. Because everyone thought, oh, there's going to be a new one, I've got to read the old ones. Or, isn't it terrible they're doing a new one? I'm going to buy the old ones. Either way, the family were delighted that Agatha was selling so many more books. And I think another of the family's hopes and aims was that new generations of readers would discover Agatha Christie's work in a way that reliably used to happen. it wasn't that long ago when, until you left home and became an adult, there wasn't that much for you to do apart from sit around being bored or read Agatha Christie. But now, there's Instagram and Twitter, and you can have your own YouTube channel, and you can do all kinds of things other than discover Agatha Christie. So, I think the family were worried that new generations of teenagers were not discovering her as reliably as they used to. And again, that's something that has picked up as well. And we can tell, and the Christie estate can tell, because of the response to the announcement, to the book. It's kind of spreading out to the young people, to those young people that I've heard of that live on a reservation somewhere. So the whole thing's has been absolutely brilliant, the whole experience. And the book, The Monogram Murders, which originally was supposed to be called, my title for it was, If Murder Began with a D. That was my original title. I thought Agatha would have liked that title, actually, because it was kind of intriguing and weird. But the problem was, half the people I suggested that title to said, oh yes, I like it, intriguing. And the other half said, if murder began with a D, yeah, that would just be Durder, wouldn't it? And it was because of the half that said Durder that we weren't allowed to call the book that. But actually, now that it's called The Monogram Murders, I am quite pleased with that title. And interestingly, it's been published in 51 countries, and probably at least 40 of them have used whatever The Monogram Murders is in that language as the title, and that's really extraordinary. And that certainly doesn't happen with my other books. My psychological thrillers are published in 32 countries, and I would say none of them use my titles or even consider using them. They just call them whatever they want. So I don't know whether that's just because The Monogram Murders is a particularly translatable title, but it could be that. So what I'm going to do now is I will tell you a little bit about what the book is about, and then I will answer any questions. I'm happy to answer any questions about any aspect of the gossip that I've not yet touched on. And before you all go, if any of you want to come along, I basically brought a kind of goodies bag, because I don't like going to talks without bringing a thing. So everything on that table, apart from the filmmaker's equipment, but my stuff on the table, books, Poirot badges, poetry pamphlets, audiobooks, just a range of stuff, is all just free for you to take. So afterwards, if you want to come along and take a thing, then do. Okay, so I will just tell you a bit about the book. It starts when Poirot is having supper in a coffee house in London, and a young woman comes in, terribly distressed and visibly frightened. And Poirot thinks, something is very much not okay here. He'd better go and, speak to her, see if there's anything he could do to help. On speaking to her, he quickly sees that his hunch was right, and she is indeed terrified. She keeps looking over her shoulder to the door, as if she expects someone to burst in. And he says to her, Mademoiselle, are you afraid of somebody? And she fairly swiftly admits that she is, that someone is after her, pursuing her, and when they find her, they will kill her. This can't be stopped, it's only a matter of time. So Poirot says, this is terrible, we must make sure this doesn't happen, at which point the young woman looks even more terrified and says, no, it is going to happen, I am going to be murdered, don't do anything to stop it. And Poirot says, come again. Well, he doesn't actually say come again, he says something more Belgian than that. Part of the reason I'm not reading the scene from the book is that I don't do a very good Belgian accent. But this young woman, Jenny, says to him, it can't be stopped, I'm going to be murdered, and you must promise me, if you have any influence with the police, promise me that you will not let them solve the crime. Don't let them investigate my murder. Don't let them find my killer. This is the only right way. Once I'm dead, justice will be done, and my killer must not be punished. So Poirot starts to put in a cursory objection to this whole state of affairs. And Jenny then panics and runs out of the coffee house, and Poirot tries to follow her, but he's a bit too rotund to be able to catch up with her. So she vanishes off into the night. Poirot then, shortly afterwards, on the same evening, comes across his friend Edward Catchpool, who is a policeman with Scotland Yard. And Catchpool tells him about a murder case that he's investigating, involving 3 dead bodies that have been found in a local posh hotel called the Bloxham Hotel. 3 guests in this hotel have been found murdered in their 3 separate hotel rooms, doors locked, and inside the mouth of each murder victim is a cufflink with the initials PIJ monogrammed onto it. And so Catchpool is describing to Poirot this very baffling case, and something Catchpool said chimes in with something Jenny said in the coffee house, making Poirot believe that whoever killed these 3 people in the hotel is the same person that's after Jenny. So that's the plot premise. Yes, I won't say any more about the plot, except for it's quite baffling and puzzling, and Poirot nearly doesn't solve it, but then he does. I don't think that's too much of a plot spoiler to say Poirot does solve the mystery in the end. Okay, I think there's 10 minutes-ish. If anyone has any questions, yes.
No, you might be surprised by my question.
Oh, that's.
What do you think? Where do you think she went when she disappeared?
Well, I know where she went, which isn't a huge achievement on my part because it's now known.
Oh,
Yes, she went to Harrogate.
oh my,
And she-
my family were brought up there. Oh.
Yeah, she went to Harrogate and she stayed in the Swan Hotel, which is why now the big annual crime writing festival is at the Swan Hotel in Harrogate.
And why do you think she went? Do you think she just needed to get away from everything?
Obviously I only know what's general. I haven't got any sort of inside intel about this, but she went basically because her first husband was a bit of a nightmare and she had to get away from him. She'd been putting up with him and hoping everything would be okay for so long, and then I think something happened where she couldn't ignore anymore the fact that he was having an affair with one of their sort of mutual friends, and I think she was someone who liked everything to be nice and had expected everything always to be, manageable and nice, and then she just couldn't cope with the fact that it wasn't. So she just sort of walked out of her own life. And then she divorced Archie Christie and eventually married Max Mallowan, who was lovely apparently, and had a very happy second marriage with him. So that's literally all I know on the subject of her disappearing. Of course, the huge irony is that now no crime writer would ever disappear to Harrogate because they just bump into a load of other crime writers. It's now the place crime writers are least likely to disappear to. Can't go there, they'll put me on a panel. Yes, Anna.
Captain Hastings, the family weren't attached to his character by Chris. Did you discuss Captain Hastings and did they ask you who the new sidekick would be? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, so Hastings is Poirot's sidekick in many of the Poirot novels, and he's also the narrator of every novel that he's in. Basically, the family, so after we established that the book was happening and that I wasn't going to change Poirot in any significant way, everything else that I sort of said, well, okay, I've got various ideas, let me consult you about them. Everything I suggested, the family just said, yes, that sounds very sensible, excellent, marvellous, go ahead. So it really was plain sailing. I was very determined that Hastings shouldn't be in my Poirot novel because Hastings is the narrator of the books that he's in. Now, I don't think one writer can copy the style of another, and I don't think they should try, really. I certainly wouldn't have wanted to set out to write a Poirot novel trying to mimic in any way Agatha's writing style or recreate it. What I wanted to do was include in the novel all the things that I thought Poirot fans would enjoy, all the things that were necessary for a Poirot novel. But I knew that my sort of authorial voice was inevitably going to be different from Christie's. And I thought, actually, a quite sensible and organic way to explain that difference would be if I'm writing in the voice of another character about whom Christie had never written. Now, Christie herself did this from time to time. So when she wrote Murder in Mesopotamia, that's narrated by a nurse, Amy Leatheran, who's not in any of the other books. The Murder at the Vicarage, the first Miss Marple, is narrated by a vicar. So it was a thing that Christie did occasionally, presumably because she wanted to, have a new voice for that book. And I thought, well, if I have Catchpool as the narrator, then if people say, well, Poirot seems slightly different in this book, there would be a totally sort of reasonable reason for that, because obviously Catchpool writing about Poirot will be different from Hastings writing about Poirot. So that was why I did it, and I'm really pleased I did, actually, because I also felt that it was, Catchpool was in a similar position to me, writing about Poirot as someone who knows him, but not someone who's necessarily been with him for very long. Yes?
Is it going to go on the telly, and if so, who would play your Poirot?
Oh, okay. Well, it's going to go on some screen, big or small. We don't yet know whether it's going to be big or small. It could be a Hollywood film. There is strong Hollywood interest. Because Ridley Scott is doing a remake of Murder on the Orient Express. That's all sort of starting to be happening now. And so because that's happening, Hollywood is thinking, Poirot could be a movie as well as just TV. So that's a possibility, although nothing definite is happening. It's just speculative. But also there's, an equally strong, possibly a stronger chance that it will end up as a TV drama. Unfortunately, the brilliant Poirot on TV, David Suchet, had just announced that he was stopping being Poirot, like 2 days before it was announced that I was writing this book. So I don't think he can be tempted back, although, I might try, but I might not. So I don't know. I can't imagine anyone playing Poirot who isn't David Suchet. And, if I were an actor, I really wouldn't want to have to be the person who was Poirot after David Suchet. So, I don't know. I mean, maybe Poirot in the TV version could, always be under a blanket, and then we could imagine he looked like David Suchet. But I don't know. I do have ideas in my head about who ought to play Catchpool. But I probably shouldn't mention those. But I recently did... I recently was a reviewer for the Radio 4 review show on Saturday nights, and I went to see a play called Oppenheimer at the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford, and the guy who played Robert Oppenheimer was an actor called John Heffernan, who was just amazing. That play is amazing, even if you don't understand any physics, which I don't. In fact, until a minute before I watched that show, I thought degrees Kelvin was degrees Kevin, but no, apparently it was Kelvin. But I still loved this play about a physicist. And the guy who played Oppenheimer was so brilliant. From the minute he walked on stage, he was just amazing. And he would be a perfect Catchpool. So as soon as the screen adaptation becomes closer to actually happening, I'll start dropping his name. And I'm not in charge of any of these things, so if it were just a book I'd written not involving the Christie estate, then I would have, I would, for example, be able to say, yes, let's sell the film rights to this person, let's sell the TV rights to that person. I don't have any say in that for this book because it's the Christie estate's intellectual property. Which is I think that's quite good. I'm quite relieved, really, Otherwise, I might start saying, I want Robert De Niro to play Poirot. Were you going to ask a question?
I was going to ask whether the family read the book before it was published.
The family did read the book before it was published, but before they read the book, they read 100 pages of plan. Because when we agreed we were doing the book, the next thing that happened was we set up a sort of, schedule of works. And the first item on the schedule was that I was going to deliver a 10 to 20 page story outline. so that we could all be happy. You know, I wouldn't have wanted to steam ahead not knowing that they had basically liked the story, and they would have been more nervous, I think, if they hadn't known what I was writing about. So I said, okay, I'll do a sort of 10, 15-page plan. And I went to stay at Greenway House, which was Agatha's holiday home in Devon, which is now a National Trust property. And there's an apartment that you can rent, as a holiday property. And hilariously, I had actually booked a holiday at Greenway before I knew I would be writing the book. I'd booked it like a year in advance. And then when we agreed we were doing the book, I had to say to Matthew, now, don't think I'm a stalker or anything, but I've got a holiday booked in your house. So I went to Greenway, and I thought, perfect place to write my 10 to 20 page plan. And so every night when the family went to sleep, I would sit up in bed in this beautiful room with my laptop, with a giant portrait of Agatha next to me, and started typing this plan. And when I got to 10 pages, I realised that I'd only really covered the first few incidents, and I thought, I basically seem to be writing the novel here in note form. So I rang Hilary, who's the managing director of Agatha Christie Limited, and I said, how would you feel about a slightly longer plan? And she said, oh, yeah, great. The more detail, the better. And by the time I went home at the end of that week's holiday, I had 100 pages of plan, and the entire novel, every incident, every single little detail, but just not well written. So just this happens, this happens, this happens, the whole thing. And actually it was brilliant, because I then sent it I tidied it up a bit, sent it to the publishers, to the family. They were all able to sort of look through, check that everything was in the right place and there was nothing they didn't like. So we all kind of knew what the book was going to contain in a very detailed way before I wrote it, which meant that when I came to write it, I didn't have to worry about plotting, about story construction, any of that. I just concentrated on writing it as well as I could. And that actually changed my writing method. I now write every book like that. I've written 2 since then. And it's just so brilliant. You write it badly first, in note form, so you get all the plot in the right place. And then you go through and improve it, knowing the plot's sorted. So that's my new method. And we've probably got time for one more question before you all come and get your free Hungarian Hercule Poirot badges. I went to Hungary to do a tour for the Hungarian version of the book, and they gave me a sort of cloth sack full of Poirot badges as I was leaving. I was like, thanks, 400 Hungarian Poirot badges. So I've been taking them to events and giving them out ever since. Yes? Oh, that's a very good question to end on. Am I doing another? Well, as I've been going about doing my, touring with Matthew, and I have done a sort of little global tour to promote Monogram Murders. And I never knew how we should answer this question. So my answer was always, well, it's early days and we're still very much focused on this book. And then I heard a journalist ask Matthew the question, and Matthew said, he sort of looked up, he said, do you know, I wouldn't be at all surprised if there were to be another one, which I thought was hilarious because he's the one who decides. So that is now my answer. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Nothing has been, firmed up at this stage, but certainly the response to the Monogram Murders has been amazing. It was a top 5 bestseller in, I think, something like 15 countries. Which, obviously it's because of Agatha Christie and it's because of Poirot, but still, it's rare that happens. So, it's done very well, and it's had really great reviews. So I think, the appetite is there. So, I too wouldn't be at all surprised if there were to be another one. And if there were to be another one, I will just say that I've got an amazing idea. And the one thing the new amazing idea has that the Monogram Murders didn't have, Monogram Murders has a very clever plot, if I say so myself, but it's not a solution that you can say in 4 words. You need about 16 words to convey the solution of Monogram Murders. The new idea, if there were to be another book, is a solution that I could tell you in 4 words what it is, and without knowing anything about the rest of the story, you would get it. In the way that you can do that with Murder on the Orient Express. You can go, ha, 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 and everyone goes, oh, and you don't need to know anything else. So yes, so I'm hoping there will be another. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Thank you.